Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly is how lumber is sawn. And because the floor that I used in the blue house is all old growth Douglas fir, and it was all quarter sawn. And when you take a look at wood in scale, one of the things that will immediately make it obvious that it's a miniature is if the grain pattern is not to scale. So when you take a look at the left-hand image there, you can see that quarter sawn means that the board is sawn in such a way that the growth rings are in a nice uniform pattern as the board goes along, versus plain sawn on the right-hand side, which gives you those cathedrals that you see quite often in regular wood. So that's important when you look at the first slide. So if you can take a look at these pieces of wood that I use for the flooring, you can see that the growth rings that are in there, I mean, some of them have got almost 75 growth rings per inch. So they're extremely fine. And that to me adds a lot of realism because it looks like it's a real board. So when it comes to laying out the floors, I cut all of the parts, fit them into the house, and create all the individual pieces in order. And then I pull them back out and I lay them all out on a board. And usually I take them outside and do all the finishing. So there's a picture of the room in progress, and the floor has all been cut and has all been placed in there. Everything is all done. And then I'll pull them all out in order. So the first thing that I do is start to add color. Now, it's important, I think, to mention that when you touch a piece of wood with anything that's got moisture in it, whether it be latex paint or something like that, that what it does is it raises the grain. So if you think about, like, when you sand a piece of wood, essentially what you're doing is you're taking the wood fibers and you're making them lay down. And if you think about it like a carpet, then like the fibers that are on a carpet, sort of combing them to make them lay down. And then when you touch it with water or moisture of any kind, those fibers that have been laid down start to swell and stand back up again. That's why when you paint something, quite often you feel it afterwards and it's all rough. And that's what's called raising the grain. So I'm using water-based aniline dyes when I do this, and it always makes them fuzzy afterwards. So I've got to knock the grain back down afterwards. So you see on the left-hand side, I've put the first color on, and then on the right-hand side, you can see those pieces have then been buffed down with steel wool to knock those fibers back down and to create a little bit of sort of authentic wear on them. And that creates my first base color and gives me a little bit of depth. And there on the right-hand side, you can see part of that floor that's had the first color all buffed down. And then on the left-hand side, you can see now that the second color has been added to it. So we're going through the process. And then once it's all, I put the shellac finish on there, and that's a multi-step finish as well. And then all of the pieces are then reassembled and then glued into place in the room. And that's what you get for a finished floor. So that's one of the bedrooms in the blue house. There's a picture of the kitchen in the blue house. And now you can start to see how that fine detail in those pieces of wood really makes a difference in terms of the realism on the floor.
It really does. And it's amazing to hear the steps that you take to get there. This is just incredible to know. And just that's the difference between, laying down a regular floor in a dollhouse or, a fine art miniature floor. Mm-hmm. So that is pretty awesome. Oh my goodness. Thank you.
So the next couple of slides here, I'm just going to talk about the greenhouse. So I just take a cheap pine board that I buy at the hardware store, run it through the bandsaw to create the strips. And then they go through a sander just to sort of knock them down a little bit. But that's essentially what it looks like when it comes off the bandsaw. And you can see that I intentionally leave the saw marks on there to make it look like it's a little more rough, because that's what it would have been, what it would have looked like when it came off the original mill when the house was built. So there on the right-hand side, you can see that I've started to apply the color to it, and you can see how rough that is. Mm-hmm. Before I then buff it down. Mm-hmm. Now, on these particular pieces, I'm using pine and pine doesn't have that nice tight grain structure that
Right.
Douglas fir did before.
Yeah.
So in order to simulate that,
Oh,
before I start to apply the color, I go at these strips with a wire brush and I brush it very hard.
oh,
And that essentially puts a lot of scratches in there, and that looks like it
uh-huh.
is the grain that's in the wood.
Right.
And you can see those scratches there on the left-hand side starting to show up, and they will collect the stain a little more
Yeah.
than the raised sections do.
So that's an awesome tip right there. I mean, usually, at least with me, I'm like, oh, I have to get cherry wood, or I have to get a hardwood. But you're saying you don't necessarily have to. You can
Nope.
create the grain look.
That's right. I've never laid a floor that's hardwood.
Wow.
It's difficult to work with.
Uh-huh.
It's expensive.
Uh-huh.
You know, a pine board I can go to the building center and get for $2.
Yeah.
You know, they sell offcuts, little scrap pieces,
Yeah.
and that's enough to do, you know, several room boxes.
Well, the finish you achieve is all you need to know. Like, yeah, you don't need to spend on you know, expensive hardwoods. You
Nope.
can create that unbelievable look with
Right.
simple wood. Or yeah,
You're making up for it in time because it takes hours and hours to do this.
oh.
But you know, there's no cost to
Nothing.
that. Right?
There's nothing is easy.
No, that's right. So in this picture, you
Yeah.
can see at the top that's had one color applied to it already.
Yeah.
And I've just basically I've got a nail that's attached to a small piece of wood, and I just use that just to poke the holes in there for the
Right.
nails at the end,
Wow.
the nail holes.
Yeah.
And then the bottom section has now had extra layers of color that have been put on that. So I build them up to give it sort of depth and realism and make it look like it's a little like they're older and that they've, you know, been worn some, and you start to get that finish.
Wow. Wow.
And there is the flooring with the first coat of finish on there, and then it'll be buffed down. There'll be a second coat on, then it'll be buffed again. Everything is all done as individual strips, and then they're glued in after it's all done. The only thing that I have left to do once the floor is glued in is apply the wax, the top coat, just to sort of dull the sheen down a little bit and fill in some of the gaps.
Just wow. That's awesome. It's
So,
awesome.
and there you can see that's the hallway of the greenhouse.
Wow.
And you can see some of those mill marks that I've intentionally left there to
Uh-huh.
make it look like that particular board was a little rougher than some of the other ones. And
Yeah.
it just gives you a little more depth is all.
Right. Depth, dimension, realism, just incredible. Wow.
And there's the dining room in that same house again with that finish that's on there. And the last technique that I used in this house, because I was trying to mix it up a little bit, same pine strips, same using the wire brush to create the grain. But instead of using multiple layers of different aniline dyes, I took a jar of vinegar, put in some steel wool and a couple of rusty nails, and let it sit for a week.
Oh my gosh.
And then once that had set in there, then you use that to brush onto the floors. And you can see that, like, when you put it on at first, you don't see anything. There's no color except, you know, the dark wood. And then you leave it and go upstairs and come back down the next morning, and that's what you get. So it's essentially that acidic mixture is reacting with the tannins that are in the wood, and it's turning it that color. And the more steel wool or the more nails that you put in there, or the longer that you leave the mix to steep, the darker the reaction is going to be. So you start to see there, that's just regular pine, and that's just with that magic mixture on there.
Wow.
And that's after 24 hours. You can see the difference.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Just beautiful. Incredible.
And there's a close-up of what it looks like. It almost looks like it's walnut. But again, that floor cost me maybe $1 in wood.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. That is just wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.